Hello and welcome. I am Evelyn Farkas, the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. Welcome to Authors and Insights. This is a series that we started many years ago in order to help Americans examine issues that have to do with character-driven leadership and the legacy of John McCain. We have invited distinguished speakers to come and present their books and really their conclusions about life, about leadership here at this forum. Today, we want to, first of all, thank the Merrill Family Foundation. They are underwriting this series, and I'm particularly excited because the guest we have today, Senator Lamar Alexander, who I will introduce properly in a minute, writes on page 84 of his book, mentioning the Washingtonian magazine, which of course is the magazine owned and published by the Merrill family. And he mentions the fact that they highlighted the tennis acumen of some of the Democratic senators, which caused him to leap into action and to challenge those Democratic senators to a great match, which was refereed by one of the greatest humorists of the time. And I will ask the senator to comment on that briefly in a moment. But let me, without further ado, really just introduce Senator Lamar Alexander. His memoir was recently published. It is phenomenal. The Education of a Senator from JFK to Trump is the name of the memoir. It's almost a history of America during that time period through 10 presidents, and of course, 6 decades of his leadership serving alongside those presidents. So Senator Lamar has a lot of experience about leadership and really what can cause success and where America has been in the past and what we should do to get to a better future going forward. Senator Alexander, who you see here on the screen, he also has been spotted during many years of his career wearing a plaid shirt, but today he's decided to wear a tie for us. But he is in his log cabin office in his home state, in Tennessee. He served with distinction as U.S. Senator for 18 years. He was known for his leadership on education, medical innovation, and maintenance of national parks. Little known fact, you have to turn off your cell phone while you're in an airplane because of Senator Alexander's legislation. From his former majority leader, so former Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, he has been praised with these words. For 18 years, there was Lamar Alexander, and there was the rest of us. He was hands down one of the most brilliant, most thoughtful, and most effective legislators any of us have ever seen. I don't have time to give, this is short shrift to your resume, Senator. We know that you made a huge influence, you had a huge impact on Tennessee, but also on America. You know what it is to serve, to put country above self, the way that John McCain did. In fact, you served with John McCain. So I'll just start with a softball. What do you want to tell us about the Washingtonian and your tennis career?
Well, that goes way back. First, thanks for inviting me. I'm a great admirer of John McCain, served with him, and love that privilege. I went to Washington for the first time in 1967 as a legislative assistant to Howard Baker, who was elected with a sort of a anti-LBJ surge of new Republican senators. And I was his legislative assistant and so-called speechwriter, although he never said what I wrote, which is another story. But so the Washingtonian wrote an article about all the Democrats and how well they played tennis. Joe Biden's and Joe Tidings and others. So I got the idea, well, Republicans can play too. So I got Senator Baker to challenge the Democrats to a tennis game, which they did. And they got Art Buchwald, the humorist, to be the umpire. But they had one little problem. One of the senators who was playing on the Republican side was Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. And another one of the senators was Senator Ed Brooke of Massachusetts, an African-American, and still another was Senator Percy of Illinois. So Senator Baker assigned Senator Brooke to play with Senator Thurmond. And the next thing we knew, Thurmond's staff called and said that Thurman wouldn't play with a black senator. So Baker played with Brooke. And when somebody asked Thurman about it, he said, nothing against him. I just have to think of the people back home. So that's how things were in 1967. I think the Democrats won, actually, the tennis match, but it went off very well with that one little hitch.
And your book does a great job in that section of the book where you talk about the civil rights legislation and what Senator Dirksen was able to achieve, together with LBJ, who was the president at the time.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what it is that you found the secret to success when it comes to landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act, or even smaller pieces of legislation, in terms of the relationship between presidents and senators?
I can give you a story. Senator Baker told me about the time in 1968 when he was in Senator Dirksen's office. He was the Republican leader, and he overheard this conversation. Dirksen was saying in that deep voice he had, "No, Mr. President, I cannot come down and have a drink with you tonight. I did that last night, and Luella is very unhappy with me." About a half hour later, there was this noise out in the hall outside the Republican leader's office, and in came two beagles, followed by a president of the United States. And Lyndon Johnson said to Everett Dirksen, "Okay, Everett, if you won't come down and have a drink with me, I'll have one with you." And they disappeared into Dirksen's back room and worked on the Civil Rights Bill. Dirksen had assigned Humphrey to, or LBJ had assigned Humphrey to help him get Dirksen. He knew he had to have him. According to David Gergen, LBJ called Dirksen every day. One time he called him and said, "Everett, wouldn't you like to go down in history as the decisive vote on the most important civil rights bill in history?" And Dirksen said, "Yes, Mr. President, I would. I'd also like to get Jim Jones appointed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals from my state." So they were transactional senators and presidents reasoning together, and out of that, they got a result.
So can you give us a little bit of an assessment, because I'm going to fast forward you to kind of more modern times, because President Obama is often, though he was also a former senator, he had a different style. Yet you were able to get things done with Senator Obama. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with President Obama?
Well, it ended up being a good one, but for the first 6 years, not so good. He seemed withdrawn. Maybe it was because Democrats won so big in 2008. Senator McCain, of course, remembers that because he got stuck with the beginnings of the Great Recession and the Obama victory after George W. was there. And Democrats had so many votes that even though Obama did appoint three Republican members to his cabinet to begin with, he didn't work very well with the Republicans in the first 6 years. But after that, we worked very well together on a bill to move most decisions back to the states about K through 12 education, and even more important, on the 21st Century Cures Act, which did so much to pave the way toward the COVID response and many of the cancer cures and other cures, stem cell therapies that we see right now. In fact, Obama said to me when he signed that bill, he called it a Christmas miracle. And he said, if it had been just you and me for these 8 years, everything would have been fine.
That's nice. That's nice. Of course, that's not how democracy works. And we know today it's pretty messy. We get a lot of, we had some questions that people submitted in advance. And some of the people who are viewing this today or every day that we will have it on our website, are concerned about the state of our democracy and whether the Senate can work effectively with the executive branch, whether it's with President Trump or with future presidents. Do you have reason for hope? Can you give our young people in particular hope and maybe some guidelines for how we can do better in the future and really tomorrow, if you will?
Well, I'm going to Lindsey Graham's funeral this week, and if my Republican colleagues ask my advice, I say I would have breakfast every Tuesday with the Democrats and read Article 1 of the Constitution to each other, because the Constitution, to preserve our freedoms, split up the power. I mean, the founders didn't trust human nature. They were sort of Calvinists. who taught that human nature was total depravity, and so they didn't plan on divine intervention to control behavior. They wanted checks and balances. So the way for the president and the Senate to work together better is for the Senate to be more assertive. Now, John McCain was certainly assertive, but so was Carl Levin, who bucked the Democrats when they tried to get rid of the filibuster. So that's what it takes. It takes senators who understand that they're elected not to work for the president, but to work for the people, and that giving the president advice is not mean you don't like him. Actually, the president needs the advice of independent senators who he can't fire.
Right, right. And in your book, you mentioned that character is more important than ideology. Can you talk about what you meant by that?
Well, here's an example. I was at Richard Lugar's funeral in 2019 in Indianapolis. Senator Lugar, former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Sam Nunn, who'd worked with Lugar on nuclear weapons limitation, was the speaker. And he said Dick Lugar was an Eagle Scout. He lived his life by the Scout law, and he began to repeat it: trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, etc. And I was sitting there thinking, and I suspect many others in the congregation were too, well, how well are we doing on that? From President Trump to me, all down to the mayor of my hometown. I mean, are we doing that? I mean, I've had a chance to work with 10 presidents really over the last nearly 6 decades, and know a couple of others. And my conclusion is that I'm a very Republican. I'm a conservative, but the most important characteristics for a president or anyone in public life to me are character and temperament. And after that, they can lean left or lean right. I prefer they lean right, but first I would say character and temperament.
Yeah. I think that we could not agree more wholeheartedly here at the McCain Institute. In fact, a lot of the work that we do is to create leaders, to elevate leaders, and advocate with leaders for human rights, democracy, and national security. So we understand that it's character-driven leadership that's required, not necessarily interest-based only. Your values should inform your decision-making. So, and you have lived that certainly throughout your life. You also made a decision very early on in your life to seek public service. What drove you to that decision, and what would you say to young people today? Should they pursue a life in the public arena?
I wrote my book to persuade them to do that, and hopefully to inspire them to do it, and to let them know that if they want to, that figuring out how to be elected or to go to work for somebody else who has is the surest way to help the most people and to be a part of keeping our republic from falling apart. You can do a lot of good things in private life, but there's some things that just have to be done in public life. I mean, if you want to control the border for immigration, if you want to solve the DACA problem for kids who brought here without being citizens, if you want to get the cancer cures through the Food and Drug Administration more rapidly, all these things require public life. Bill Frist came to see me in 1994 and said he was going to run for the Senate. And I said, why would you give up being the world's leading transplant heart surgeon? He said, today I can perhaps save one life at a time, and somebody will thank me for it a year later. If I'm a senator, maybe I can save 1 million lives. He was elected. He went to work with George W. Bush, and they created PEPFAR, which saved 23 million lives of people with HIV/AIDS. So I say to young people that if you have a sense of purpose and a sense of humor, that you can tolerate all the indignities of public life. If you want to get something done, that's the best place to do it.
Yeah, it's the maximum impact in terms of public good. Yeah.
Well,
Though it's not always easy.
not always easy, but that's all right. I mean, the way if all you're in it for is to make a speech and insult somebody, you might as well stay home, because there's no need putting up with all the indignities. But if you're trying to solve the immigration problem, or trying to cure cancer, or trying to solve the problem of people with HIV/AIDS, or build our national defense, all these things Senator McCain worked on, well, then your best chance to do that is from an elected position, and not always in the Senate. You can do it as a school board member or the mayor or the city councilman, or you can do it working for somebody who's elected.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at any level, you can contribute and you can be in public office and you can be either elected or unelected. I say that as a former um, uh, government worker appointee, if you will.
Sure.
I wonder if you thought about the span of your career and the things that you've been able to achieve in partnership with other leaders at any level, really, and you've worked at all levels. What was the most unusual relationship you had where people would say, well, that's odd that they got together and achieved X? Is there something that comes to mind, that people would say, the person you partnered with wouldn't have been the expected partner, and maybe the outcome wasn't expected?
Well, there'd probably be a tie between President Obama and President Trump. I mean, people would say to me, how can you work with that big liberal? And then on the other hand, people could say, how can you work with Trump? Senator Roy Blunt said that by noon every day, Donald Trump has done almost everything my mother taught me not to do. So, but here's the way I looked at that. I thought the people elected the president and they elected me, and they expect us to respect each other's office and work together when we can. And I was able to do that with President Obama, especially in his last 2 years when I was chairman of the Education and Health Committee. And I was able to do it with President Trump on a number of things, including the Great American Outdoors Act, which was a coalition of Trump and 800 environmental groups. Some people said that was an unholy alliance, but it was an important alliance because it helped maintain our national parks. And we also dealt with surprise medical billing and fixing the FAFSA, the form that 20 million students fill out every year to go to college to get their grant and aid or their loan. Doesn't sound very important to many people, but its complexity was the biggest barrier to low-income students going to college.
That's great. Those are huge achievements. So in your book, you mentioned something, I don't know if it's your phrase that you coined, but you talk about digital democracy and your concern about America's digital democracy. Can you explain to our viewers what you mean by that, and maybe take it a step further? What are the problems? What are the solutions?
Well, I'm not sure I have the solution. I have some ideas, but what I mean by it is the explosion of social media after about 2008, when Senator McCain ran for president. I remember when Scott Brown came into our Republican caucus in the Senate in 2010, and he had just won the Senate seat in Massachusetts that Senator Kennedy had held before he died. And we said, how in the world did you do that? That's such a Democratic state. And he held up a device and said, I used Facebook. Well, we were just getting accustomed to Blackberries then, but social media just burst onto the scene about 2008. And what it's done is push our political discussion to the extremes. So you have 4, 5, 7% of the registered voters electing the most right-wing Republican or the most left-wing Democrat, leaving center-left or center-right people with no one to vote for that they're happy with in the general election. So, and it's also discouraged the kind of compromise that Senator McCain did when he worked with Senator Kennedy in 2013. Lindsey Graham did too. I did too. Senator Corker did too. We had a group of us. And we passed an immigration bill in the Senate in 2008, or 2013, which if the House had taken it up and passed it, would have controlled the border and dealt with the undocumented people who are here today. It saved us a lot of trouble. Well, the difficulty of passing that today is much harder because there's so much reward for making extreme, often insulting statements about other people, and not much reward for trying to work with somebody with whom you disagree to get a result.
How do you see that unfolding into the future? Do you foresee continued polarization? And maybe I'll add a question, what do you see as the future of the Republican Party? Because there's the kind of traditional wing, which you were part of, I would argue, although you can correct me if I'm wrong. Senator Graham was part of that wing, but also was part of the new MAGA wing in a sense, because he was such a good channel and friend of President Trump's. Sort of, what do you see as the future of the party and of politics in general in the U.S.?
Well, it all depends on who gets elected. And you use Lindsey Graham's a good example. I read these articles of people who were criticizing him for working with Trump. Well, they didn't want him to work with Trump. They shouldn't have elected Trump president. I mean, Lindsey liked to accomplish things. That's why he worked with John McCain so much. I mean, every time I was working on immigration or climate change or trying to make our ports better, I'd go to try to find Lindsey because he was there to accomplish something. I used to tell my colleagues in the Senate, it's hard to get here, hard to stay here. So while you're here, you might as well try to accomplish something good for the country. So I think a new generation of public servants needs to run for office and say, we're not going up there to shout and scream. We're going up there to fix a problem. We want to reduce the debt. We want to solve the immigration problem. We want the medicines in the doctor's offices more quickly, and be willing to confront the shouters and the screamers. I also think that the way to do it probably is to use social media to deal with the social media problem and use it to attract a lot more people into the primaries.
I have asked you a lot about leadership, and I want to ask you maybe about things that have stayed the same since you were in office that you consider good. So you mentioned the filibuster, but are there other things that have remained constant that you consider positive when you look at government?
Well, actually, one thing that has stayed the same is the structure of the United States Senate. Now, people keep trying to change it, but what the Senate needs is not a change of rules, like get rid of the filibuster. It needs a change of behavior. The reason the Senate doesn't work as well as it should is because senators don't allow each other to offer their amendments. Back in the 1980s, when Senator Baker and Senator Byrd were the leaders, they would come in on Monday and they would say, everybody bring your amendments in, and there would be hundreds. Then they would get unanimous consent to vote on them all and allow 10 minutes debate on each one, and they'd start voting. And along about Thursday, they'd say, okay, we're going to finish this week. And pretty soon people would start withdrawing their amendments, but they'd get it done. And people had their say that way. Today, if I don't like your amendment, I just object to it. You can't bring it up. Then you object to mine. I can't bring it up. And we have what we have today. So we don't need to change the filibuster rule, and we really don't need to change the structure of the Senate. We just need senators who are willing to use the Senate to do what it's supposed to do, to force compromise among people who don't completely agree, to get a result that most senators can vote for and that most voters will accept.
Yeah, we at the McCain Institute have worked with the Ted Kennedy Institute with former senators to talk about where the Senate can be reformed. And for the most part, everyone agrees it's the norms. As you said, it's not so much changing the rules, although many of them would like the leadership to have a little less control over things like whether you could offer amendments. So,
well, that's true. But the reason that happens is because of the influence of the media today. If you've got in the digital democracy, you've got a new headline every, once an hour. And it's hard for a body of 50 Democrats, say, to respond 7 times a day. And so the parties give their leaders the authority to speak for them, and you get a more centralized Senate. And it would be better if the committees had more of the responsibility. I agree.
So the last question, well, the second to last question, is there anything you'd like to say to the audience about America's role in the world and your perspective on it? You touch upon it a little bit in your book. Obviously, you have a deep domestic experience, but because we also like to talk about the world, what are your thoughts with regard to the future of American leadership?
Well, we have to be, number one, what President Reagan called an example to the world, and we don't look like an example when we're arguing about whether our elections are stolen or not when they're not stolen. Typically, we're the country that sets the example so other countries have good elections. Second, we need to remember history and not allow tyrants like Putin to run over Ukraine. John McCain spent a lot of time reminding us of that, and that was very, very important to do. So as a big power, we have big responsibilities and we need to exercise them. How we do it is a different question. I think often as I look at the Iran war about how President H.W. Bush handled the Gulf War. He planned it for several months. He got support from all over the world. He got the rest of the world, in fact, to pay for it. That war cost America about $6 to $8 billion. We've already spent over $200 billion on the current war. He had a limited objective. He put 1 million men on the ground. He got to the gates of Baghdad, met his objective, and came home in a week. That's the kind of execution of American leadership we need in the world when it's necessary to do it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for the mention of John McCain. We also work on Ukraine. We carry forward his legacy in that avenue of work as well. The last question for you is, what have I not asked you that you wanted to cover in this interview today?
Well, I think you did ask it, but I think maybe I'll repeat it. I think in public life, it helps to have a sense of purpose and a sense of humor. When I told my wife I wanted to run for governor a second time after I'd gotten beat the first time, she said, wait a minute. She said, first, I want to know, why are you running for governor? And what do you hope to accomplish? And why is it good for the state? And why is it good for us? And that's a question that everybody in public life needs to ask himself or herself before they run. Senator Ted Kennedy was asked that question by Roger Mudd. And why do you want to be president? He did such a poor job answering it over 21 minutes that he dropped out of the race. So having a clear sense of purpose is the way you make your way through this digital democracy and all of the indignities that come along with public life. If you know that you're there for a purpose, whether it's to help Ukraine, fight cancer, do something about HIV, AIDS, fix immigration, if you know you're doing that, the indignities kind of fade away. Lose your sense of purpose, and there's really not much reason to be in public life.
That is excellent, Senator. Thank you so much for that. I think that sums up so beautifully the underlying thread throughout your wonderful book. And I should show it to the audience with my little Post-its. It encapsulates it perfectly. I think it's also something that young people should pay attention to, because there's a lot of talk about authenticity. Well, authenticity really comes from having that purpose, knowing what you stand for, and then being unafraid, just going forward and pursuing your objectives. And you have done that so phenomenally throughout your entire career, and you're not done. I mean, with this book, you're still engaged, you're still in the arena, as Teddy Roosevelt and John McCain love to quote that. Used to say, you're the man in the arena. So thank you for making time to be with us today. We hope that we can continue to stay in touch with you. We hope that the viewers will go out and buy this book. It's full of lovely anecdotes. I can't even tell all the stories. There's some heartbreaking stories, of course, of your wife's last year or two on this earth. Your dog, who is a wonderful companion, and we have
and there's a wonderful story about John McCain talking to us when we were at Christmas time, when we were debating the health care bill, and how he sort of talked about the time in 1970 when he'd been in solitary confinement for 2 years, and the guards took him out to exercise, and one of them drew a cross in the dirt. And I remember John saying, aren't we lucky to live in this country as we do?
Yes, amen, aren't we? So thank you for everything you've done. I think your book is really a positive tribute to service, and I hope young people read it. Of course, I'm sure many of your former colleagues and people who have lived through the span of this history will read it with interest as well, and they'll look themselves up in the index, very Washington style. For our viewers, again, we encourage you to read the book. We encourage you to reach out to the McCain Institute. You can find us online, McCainInstitute.org. We're on all your social media outlets. If you have ideas about other statesmen that you or women that you would like us to interview, please let us know. Thank you so much for tuning in, and see you at the next Authors and Insights.